Hi, this is James, and I'd like to welcome you to part 2 of this video series where I'm sharing the meanings that I use when I read Kipper cards. In part 1 of this series, we walked through the first 6 cards of the deck, and in this video installment, we'll be taking a look at the next 6 cards. So if you happen to be just joining me for this series, I'd like to give you a little bit of a recap. This video series was inspired by one of my regular viewers. Her name is Carolyn. And Carolyn had requested that I do a follow-up to my Lenormand series where I talked about each of the meanings that I have for the cards. But she asked if I would be willing to use Kipper for this particular series. And she went one step further in her request and asked if I would be willing to work with the Fin de Siècle Kipper cards. They are by Ciro Marchetti. So that is the deck that's going to be assisting me through this exploration of Kipper. And as I shared in the previous video, we'll be taking a look at the deck 6 cards at a time in each video installment. So like I said at the beginning, we're now in the midst of looking at the next group of 6. So now that I've talked about the inspiration, I've talked about the deck, I've talked a little bit about the format, let's take a closer look at the next 6 cards in our walkthrough of the Kipper. And here we are with card 7 in the deck, and card 7 is Message. Message is pretty straightforward, as it generally represents all types of news and messages. Message also represents communication and correspondence, so you can consider things like phone calls, emails, text messages when this card turns up. Traditionally, it's known as pleasant letter. And so the word pleasant can imply that the news or the messages or the communications are good in nature. But that will depend on surrounding cards in the reading. For me, message is also a card that can represent paperwork, documents, forms, can represent a letter, or some other piece of mail. And this is a card that can represent timing. So it's a timing card or timing device. If you have a question that has timing built in, and this card appears, it indicates a possible period of 7 days to a week. So wrapping up message is a card of news and messages. It represents all forms of communication and correspondence. And so now let's move on to card 8 in the deck. And here we have card 8 in the deck, and card 8 is false person. So this is a person card. And this would describe a person as being dishonest, insincere, or deceptive. You can consider such people like drama kings or queens with this card, someone who's a troublemaker, somebody who's a hypocrite, or somebody who is a frenemy. Because of the imagery on the card, I tend to look at this card as people who are actors. You know, the idea of someone who's playing a role or a part. And sticking with the imagery, I sometimes see this card as representing a costume party or a masquerade. Again, because the man and the woman on a card are wearing costumes. Sometimes I see this card as representing the idea of not being the real you, that you are putting up a front or a false image. In my daily draws, for me, I tend to ramp this card down. So for me, when it appears, it can just represent something that's wrong, something that's bad, you know, making a mistake or a faux pas or some kind of error. So the last thing I want to say about false person is we want to take into account direction because it's a person card. And as I always say, Kipper is a system that is heavily reliant on direction. And so just like all the other people cards that we've talked about up to this point, both the woman and the man on the card are facing us. So they're looking directly at us. So if you read traditionally with left being the past and cards on the right being the future, this would still apply with this card. And I tend to read the same way. I tend to look at any cards that are on the left side of false person to be the past, because the backs of the people are to those cards, and cards on the right to be the future because they are facing those cards. But again, as I always say, that is of personal preference. So now, wrapping up false person can represent a person or a situation. So as a person, it could be somebody who's dishonest, insincere, or deceptive. But as a situation, it could represent something that is wrong, something that is bad, or some sort of mistake or error has been made. And so now let's move on to the next card in the deck. And here we are with card 9 in the deck, and card 9 is change. And so when change turns up, generally speaking, it can represent a change in circumstances. So some of the things this card can highlight would be a move or a relocation. And if you take a look at the image on the card, there is a man who is loading up his car. So that's where that idea of a move or relocation comes in. But it can also highlight a career change or a job change, even a relationship change. And if it's not a change in one's outer world, outer circumstances, the change card can also represent inner change. And with that, it could represent a change in outlook or behavior. And coming back to the image on the card, for me, when this card turns up, it can represent something having to do with one's car or other types of vehicles. And this is a card I keep in mind when it comes to direction. You again take a look at the image on the card. You'll notice that the car is facing to the right. So for me, when I'm considering what kind of change this card is talking about, I tend to consider any cards that are on the right side of this card, because the car is facing that direction. And then the last thing I want to say about the change card is that this for me is also a timing card, just like message that I talked about earlier. And so if you're asking a question that has timing built into it, and this card turns up, it can suggest a time period of 6 to 7 weeks. So again, wrapping up with change, change represents a change in our circumstances. And so now let's move on to card 10 in the deck. And here we have card 10 in the deck, and card 10 is Journey. And generally speaking, Journey is a travel card. And it can highlight such things as a trip or a vacation. And just like Change, the card that came before it, this is also a card of movement. Journey can also be a card of transportation. And here we have, in the image on the card, we have a train station or train platform. And so just as change can represent automobiles and vehicles of that nature, this card can also represent trains. And staying with the idea of being in a train station, then Journey can also be a card about arrivals and departures, because people do both in a train station. You know, they either are going somewhere or they're arriving. Now this is another card where I keep direction in mind when it shows up. And what I do is I tend to consider the cards that are on the left side of this card to kind of give me some more information as to the nature of the journey being talked about. And the last thing I want to say about Journey for me is another timing card. And so if you're asking a question and timing is built into the question, timing's a factor in the question, and this card turns up, it could suggest a time period, just like message, of 7 days or 1 week. So wrapping up Journey, generally speaking, is a card that can represent travel. And so since we just talked about travel, let's now travel onto card 11 in the deck. And here we have card 11 in the deck, and card 11 is Sudden Wealth. And sudden wealth can represent money that comes suddenly, or there's some unexpected nature or quality to it. So this is a card of financial gain or increase. And it implies money that you didn't have to work for in order to receive it. So it can represent the lottery. It could represent a bonus. It could represent sweepstakes, found money, or an inheritance. Now going with the image on the card, we have a slot machine. And so for me that symbolizes gambling, luck, because of the 777, and games of chance. And so with the idea of gambling or games of chance, you have to consider what are the odds and what are the stakes in order to play the game. Now I also know this card to be titled Gaining a Lot of Money. So if the situation that's being looked at with the cards isn't about money, and this card turns up, then you might want to consider the idea again of a gain of some kind or something being increased. And then the words a lot in gaining a lot of money can suggest more of something, many of something, or multiples of something. Right? I tend to think of it in that case, I tend to think of the idea of accumulation. And then the last thing I want to say about sudden wealth is the idea of something sudden. So again, if it's not about money, then it could suggest something that's sudden or taking place suddenly. Or again, there's some sort of unexpected nature or quality to the situation. So wrapping up sudden wealth. Sudden wealth is a financial gain or increase card, but it carries the underlying message that it's about money that you didn't have to work for in order to receive, and there may be a sudden or unexpected quality or nature to that monetary increase. And so now let's move on to the final card for this video segment, and that is Privileged Lady. And now we've come to the final card for this installment of the video series, and we're at card 12, which is Privileged Lady. In traditional Kipper cartomancy, this is known as Rich Girl. And Rich Girl, or Privileged Lady, is a person card. And she represents someone younger than main male or main female. So this could be a daughter, a niece, a cousin, or a younger sister. If it's not a familial type of relationship, then Privileged Lady can represent a best friend or a girlfriend. At any rate, Privileged Lady represents a young woman who's privileged, playing on the name of the card, or has means, and that would go back to the other name for this card, Rich Girl, because has means implies being rich or wealthy. Now for me, I have some meanings about this card if I take the personal aspect of it and not make it about a person. And in that case, Privileged Lady can represent things like beauty, joy, creativity, and fun. It can also represent admiration. And bringing the personal aspect of it back in, this could represent a person you admire or is admired. And one of the final things I want to say about Privileged Lady is that this is a card that can represent the partner of a lesbian, much like mature female. So when you're doing same-sex readings, you have a choice of who is going to represent the partner of main female. And again, that would be personal preference. Now, this is a card of direction, being a person card, so you want to keep direction in mind when this card appears. And just like all the other people cards that we've talked about up to this point, Privileged Lady is also facing us. She's looking directly at us. So if you traditionally read cards on the left to be the past and cards on the right to be the future, you could do that with this card as well. And just like I've said with some of the other cards we've talked about before, I tend to read it differently because her body is facing to the left. So cards on the left of Privileged Lady for me would be the future, and cards to her right would be the past because her back is to those cards. For me, it looks like she's literally walking towards the cards that would be on her left side, or my left side. So wrapping up Privileged Lady. Privileged Lady will always represent a woman who is younger than main male and main female. And that will bring this installment of the series to a close. We've covered the first 12 Kipper cards, and we're now a third of the way through the entire deck. So as I close, I'm James Himm Mitchell, and I'd like to thank you for being here with me, and I look forward to being with you again for part 3, where we'll talk about the next 6 cards, cards 13 to 18. So until then, I'm hoping you have a wonderful day, and take care.